I'm noting that it's a short notice for people to come and join this call, given that this call is decided at last week's meeting, and a lot of people might have forgotten about it. So, but today's meeting is more about administrative stuff rather than a lot of the FHIR content stuff. So we probably can be a bit more relaxed about the attendance. All right, in the interest of time, let's kick started. Let me share my screen. All right, you should be able to see the screen that I'm sharing, which has the draft agenda, which fits nicely into one screen. So for people to peruse. So I will pause for a minute or so to invite comments about the draft minutes to see whether or not we are in agreement with the draft agenda, and whether or not any changes would be needed for the draft agenda. All right, not hearing anything, I assume that silence is assent. So we'll take the draft agenda as the agenda items for us to go through today's meeting. We have a few largely administrative type of agenda items to go through today. Now, the first agenda item is approval of meeting minutes of last week. Given that we have a very short turnaround time, and the meeting minutes is still being processed, we will defer the meeting minutes approval until our next meeting. So with that out of the way, so we move on to the second agenda item, which will be updates and news. So over to you, Brett.
Well, the only thing to note is the ballot period, which is opening this
week
Friday.
or what?
Yeah, this Friday.
Yep.
The 20th. And we only have the AUPS ballot running since we stopped the 6.1 ballot. We have 57 signed up for the AUPS ballot, which is pretty good, and that's already been submitted and put up. So if you are part of that ballot, you should be able to vote.
57. Is it 56 or 57?
57. Yeah, 57.
So 57 people registered, which I am thoroughly pleased by, actually, and didn't expect it. That's the same numbers we've gotten in August ballots. I kind of thought
that's good.
This different cycle might see lower numbers, but it looks like we've maintained the numbers for ballot for working standards. So that's really good. Some of the other updates are community Zulip polls. I've popped one in the chat. There's a couple out on core that I'll also chat that we would ask people to contribute to, because some of these have a relationship to base as well. And I think, actually, while I'm doing that, we've got Angus on the line. Angus, do you guys have any polls or anything out for e-requesting that we should also be looking at in this group?
I'm not aware of any polls that we have for e-requesting, but the only one I'm aware of is the one about the identifier type code things, which wasn't e-requesting.
Yeah.
Guys. But yeah, I'm not aware of any polls running.
There isn't any.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I just wanted to check.
Confirm that there isn't any.
Yeah, I'm not aware of any either. Just confirming that.
Yep, thank you. So any further supplementary information, Danielle, from you?
Slightly. In terms of Zulip polls, while this isn't coming to AU base yet, what's being sort of proposed for AU core is an endpoint, AU core endpoint. So I'm going to put the Zulip poll in so that people can have a look at it. And I think it's a possibility that out of the discussions in AU core that there might be the suggestion we do an AU base endpoint. Maybe, maybe not. Endpoint is one of those ones that might be like device where it doesn't really make sense to do a base profile. But I think some of that will fall out of the core discussions. So I wanted to put that in this group because I think the endpoint usage is wider than a lot of just one use case. For me, it's that time of year, I guess, basically, that you will see a lot of polls coming out on Zulip as we start to shape the new kind of development for all the specs.
So given those polls will have impacts on the work going forward, do you want to set up reminders for people, or we'll leave it to community decision?
I think at this point it's an opt-in. If you want to contribute. The people on the call are the right people to be advertising this too, which is why I'm doing that. Some stuff is going out on mailing lists as well for different groups. But I think I think the polls will close by the time we do our next FHIR Work Group meeting, which is in person in Sydney. So I guess we'll have a report back on what's relevant that's come out of that. So okay. I don't think we need to track it as an action, I guess. I think that stuff will be closed by then.
All right, thank you. So just a question to Brett, given that you are taking notes for today's meeting, can you include those Zulip poll links in the meeting minutes so therefore people can access them if they need to?
Excellent.
Awesome. All right. If there isn't anything else on agenda item number 2, then we'll move on to agenda item number 3, which we have Richard join us at today's call. So, Richard.
Hi. Yeah, I'm not quite sure where to start with this. Okay. Do people want some background, or we've only got a few attendees? I think everybody understands the background for where we are. If anybody wants some background.
I think it's the same people. I think we're good with background for this crowd.
Yep, fine. Okay, so I've created draft profiles in a branch for HAE and HSP-O profiles. They're up there for consideration to merge into base. I think they're ready to go. I would like them to become part of a whatever the thing is, an STU release of AU base so that they can be made available to the provider directory that's being produced as part of Health Connect. And they'll want to have that out the door long before AU base release 7. Okay, so that's that. The other thing I've got going at the moment is attempting to get more clarification on what we want to do with identifier type in our AU-based profiles. I might share a screen for a moment.
Okay, I'll stop sharing so that you can share.
Share small enough that people can reach you. And now we'll come to which one is. Have I chosen the right one? Yes, I've chosen the right one. Okay.
Okay. Yep. Got
Yep.
it.
Okay, right. So let's make that a bit bigger. Okay, so one of the things that came up was what do we want to do for the different values of identifier type? And one idea is we're on a good path, we should stick to it. And NOI for national object identifier is an appropriate type for the things like HAE and HSP-O and HPIO and PAIO. And another one is, well, look, maybe we don't need to have all these identifier types. So that was the point of this Sulit poll, was to see what people do with them. Oh, I haven't looked at this in a day or so, so we've got a bunch here. It seems that there's a lot of use of them, and people use them for things like query and storage. And I think we've got here Angus saying that they're useful. So I think what we basically got from this is that our current path of using identifier type is worth continuing. There's no real value to do any to change from it. And likewise, we want to encourage the use and generally mandate the use of identifier type on identifiers, so people know how to process them appropriately. That's relevant. Yep.
Can I make a comment that I think they're useful where the type of identifier you're referring to has sort of subtypes like DVA. Like it's not useful on IHI, right? Like an IHI has a system. We know it's an IHI. There's no variants of IHI. So the type code IHI or NI, sorry, or IHI, I don't know what the use of that is. Like it, but only when you've got things that have many variants, like medical record numbers, right? I can have Melbourne Health medical records, Queensland Health medical record numbers. There's a litany of them, right? And I don't necessarily know all their systems. I can group them and go, these are medical record numbers because they all have the type code MR, right? So to me, it's doesn't make sense everywhere. It makes sense when the identifier is not a concrete single thing like an IHI. It's a class of identifiers like medical record numbers. It makes sense.
I think there's well put. There's another class where the DVA ones. So DVA have got the one system which covers many different identifiers. So that sort of goes the other way. People are interested in that one because they want finer granularity than you can get from system rather than an aggregation of different things. They've got different systems. So they're two, in a sense, opposite uses of identifier that make them more convenient for people.
I agree. And that's kind of what I meant by subtypes. Like there's subtypes of DVA. Like you can just say, oh, it's a DVA number, but you could also say, no, this is a gold one, it's an orange one, it's a white one. And then if you look at like record number, patient internal number, filler order number, placer order number, they're all not a defined system, right? The system is whoever's creating the identifier, but by having the type, at least I can find it. I can find the filler order number because it has fill on it. And I have to deal with many different filler order numbers from different providers, right? From Magentus, Best Practice, Helios, whoever they are. And I don't know what all their systems are, but at least when I'm in a message, I expect to find one of them and I can find it using the type.
Someone's got their hand up.
Yeah, so
Yeah,
I assume that's Brett, right?
No, well, sort of. It's me.
It's you.
Hi, this is
Okay.
Dania. We're in the same meeting room, so Brett and I will be trading off that. I had a question around querying around that one. So in terms of querying, like searching for things, does that mean that sometimes you're using the identifier type, but sometimes you're using the system URL, Angus?
Exactly. Sometimes, and when I say query, it's more than just query in a FHIR server, right? It might be messages traversing through, right? Like I'm looking in a set of identifiers trying to find what I want, but sometimes like the filler order number, right? Like it's not not always looking for Magentus's filler order number. I really don't care where it's coming from, but I care which of the identifiers is the filler order number. And this one might be from Magentus, this one might be for best practice. I don't care. I just need to know what's the filler order number. And if there's two of them, I'd error, right? It would make no sense in that context. But without the type code, I'm lost. I'm like, I don't know. I don't know what Magentus's system is for their filler order number. And now I have to know it to find the filler order number, even though I don't care. All I want to know is where is the filler order number?
Okay. That was one of my questions. I have another one that I think is more related to narrowing down some NOI content. I mean, I think this is a useful conversation to keep having, and I appreciate, Angus, you talking about using both system and I assume in a FHIR sense you're using the URL form, and then in, I don't know, if you're searching across V2, that wouldn't have the URL, and in CDA, that would be an OID. If we're talking like IHI, for example, I think it has different representations.
IHI has, I don't care that the type code NI is there, but I don't personally can see a use for it, right? Because in an IHI scenario, at least in FHIR, there's always a well-known system, the system for IHI. I just use that. I don't care what the code is, but when you talk about a medical record number, I don't know every medical record number system for every hospital in the country, but I certainly can find the medical record number because it has a type code MR on it.
Yep. All right. Thank you. And then when we get to talking about NOI, there were some things that I wanted to. I don't think, Richard, you've put forward the proposal yet, but I know that we've talked about some options, and I think that we could spend some time today furthering the development of those solution options around the use of the NOI code, type code.
Yep. I think this might be it. What should NOI mean? Okay. This one. So one of the things with NOI at the moment is NOI currently includes two identifier types. It includes the HPIO and it includes a PAIO. So both of them are identifiers that identify organisations. The HPIOs are issued by the HI service in accordance with the health identifier legislation. The PAIOs are issued by the My Health Record. The P stands for PCHR, which shows how old they are. And the thing was, there were various organisations that needed to be assigned identifiers, and it was important that it was important to the My Health Record that they were assigned identifiers, but they weren't entitled to get HPIOs. So that was the origin of those ones.
The PAIO have a different FHIR system than a HPIO, or we're not?
They do.
Yes.
They do. They have a different system. So what we got there is,
I think I think it's important to recognise that where we've come from, there's an extensible binding from international. So in a sense, where anything actually fits the international binding, we've had to use the international code. And then where it hasn't, we've looked at our local needs and made decisions at the time. That's why you often see it looks inconsistent in hierarchical code use, because we have that like foundational thing, and then we've gone, but if I want to do something more specific with identifier type, and the discussion from the community at the time was yes we do, that's why there's a more specific concept. Wherever we had a discussion and like for some things where they went, no, actually that international code is as far as we need to go, we stayed with the international code. So the inconsistency is representative of the community use case agreement constrained by the extensible binding from international. And I guess we're coming out with two new identifier types, and we have to have the same discussion. What is the use case need for these two? And how are we constrained by the extensible binding in international? At this point, the NOI code is Australian, so it looks like we aren't constrained at all by international. So it is purely just a local discussion on, is it useful because I think what seems like the most preferred solution option from people I've heard is that the NOI concept gets made specific to national organisational identifiers coming from basically Services Australia. And so we just say anything with an NOI code is something that has come from Services Australia and is managed and issued by them.
What about IHI? Is that not managed?
No, because it's not an organisational one. So NOI is National Organisational Identifier.
Okay, all because of the organisation part. Yep. Okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
And so we would, at this point, we'd had two, and now, well, actually, we've got one, and now we're actually saying there's two others. So there would now be three identifiers, and there could be more in the future that we would recognise using NOI, and therefore you could then use that for querying to go, give me the NOI for you.
So I can see another problem is these type codes fairly seem to align, and because they come from a HL7 version 2 table 203, they are kind of needed in V2. Like in FHIR, we don't care because we have the system URL, but in V2 we have no system URL, right? So we tend to have codes like that, and we have a signing authority and a type code.
Oh, I've heard of it,
and if you're converting from say V2 to FHIR, and you want a different, and let's say we're getting HPIOs and PAIOs. When I get that V2S message, I need to know, is this a HPIO or is this a HPIO? Because I need to use the right system when I put it in FHIR. And so if anything, we need to just make sure that when we're in a V2 message and not FHIR, can we split the difference between which one's a HPIO and which one is a PAIO? Can't do that, then we're kind of caught, right? I can't create the FHIR representation.
Now that is exactly the thing that was raised around why we have that Zulip thing on how do you use it. Because I think that whole, when do we create specific type codes to support behaviour, and that's really common behaviour that you're talking about, Angus, is one of the reasons that we would say, no, let's actually create specific codes so that you can do that.
I mean, only one of them will be valid in a data type profile, though.
I don't know. We're not actually sure. Although what we were kind of talking about, and that's where it becomes really interesting, is if you're converting it in a message, sure, but if you're storing something in your database, how many slots do you have available? And I know we've talked about saying HPIOs and HSP-Os are mutually exclusive, but we're less clear on that HAE one. We actually think that might.
Yeah, but there's definitely constraints that will prevent this issue.
I guess what I'm saying is if a system is going, I've got a field in my database, I've got one field, and based on your type code, I'm just slotting things in, then I guess that's why we're asking the question of what do we want to use these codes for, so we have the right granularity.
Yeah.
Like if that makes a lot of sense to make it easier to process from V2 to FHIR.
So we could come up and decide that NOI was a mistake, and that there actually should be one type for HIPPOs and another type for PAIOs, and that it was a mistake and that perhaps not a mistake, but that and that we don't want to live with that going forward, and that we would rather they have two different types.
I think that's a good reason. Yeah.
I think every new identifier we use, we need to cover signing authority code like OSHIC, which is a V2 thing, the type code like NOI, and the FHIR system. Like for me, because I span so much between V2 and FHIR and less CDA, so OID would be the other one, but I less encounter it. But for every type of identifier, I really want to know what's its assigning authority code, what's its type code, what's its FHIR system URI, and if I was working with CDA, what's its OID? Like if you gave me those four concepts for every new identifier, And using those four concepts, I can uniquely identify that identifier as opposed to some other identifier. Then I'm good, I think.
So
That
Richard, a
breaks
quick,
down.
That's good.
Sorry.
Richard, a quick questions. What was the thinking or the rationale that sort of make that sort of substantiated decisions to have a NOI that covers both HPIO and also PAIO? Was there any justification for that?
That I don't remember being involved in that choice, and I haven't come up with a good reason for why it was done that way.
It's going to be just
Maybe
because
someone else, maybe someone else knows why it was a good choice, but Angus is basically seem to be saying that choice makes working with V2 hard. So that would seem to be a reason to revisit that choice.
Yep.
I wonder whether the choice was made just because the term National Organisation Identifier. So people went, oh, well, this is a National Organisation Identifier, therefore we're going to reuse NOI. And that's one way of looking at it, but you kind of need to look at all the other identifiers in the landscape. And for an implementer point of view, how do I tell the difference between them all, right? Like if you keep calling them all NOI, then that's no use to me. I have to look at something else. And in V2, all I have is the signing authority, which is usually OSHIC, the Medicare, if you will, a type code. I don't have a system. So if you make them all OSHIC NOI, but they're all different things, I can't tell them apart. And therefore I can't represent them in FHIR correctly because I don't know which one's which.
Do you mind if I actually make?
So there are two questions to consider before we make a decision to deprecate NOI and sort of in favor of the specific. So question number one is we need to sort of get to the bottom of what are the rationales that propel the decision for the NOI at the beginning. And number two is that are there any existing implementation that uses NOI and when we change them, that will cause problems?
Yeah, they definitely are.
Yeah, definitely are. Yeah. We're using it for HPIOs, right? Like.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to know how many people are using it for PO.
Whether or not they are.
No, I wouldn't have thought a lot. But
Yeah, I wouldn't have thought a lot.
Does PAO have its own number? No, it's uses.
But we do need to sort of differentiate PAIO from HPIO though, given that the HPIO has a specific definition, which is health care provision specific, and PAIO doesn't.
Now some of these are the
can I point you to this table in the V2 spec?
Go on.
So I think this is the right thing to have the Connectathon breakout on. Basically, these are the right questions.
Because if we can have a rationale and a system, that's really excellent. So we can just go through what exists and see if it meets the criteria. And
so this is in the V2 spec, right? So see that table there? They're identifier types. They're the NOI we're talking about, right? And it's telling me which one is for which, right? And then below that table, the next table under it, they're way down.
Where's no? Here's NOI. See?
Yeah. Yep. Oh, look, it says PAI there. So now scroll to the table below it.
Hang on.
Right?
It also says it does a GSO, which is not one I thought of.
Yeah. There are GSOs as well.
And also a CSP.
You changed the definition. Yeah.
Interesting. So you want to go to the next table?
Yeah, next table. So in V2, you're going to get that code and this code here, right?
Yeah.
So if you give me a PAIO and a HPIO and they both have OSHIC and they both have NOI, then I can't tell you which one's which.
It means that they can access your financial.
And that's the problem I see.
Is it important that you can't tell?
Well, it's important if I have to create a valid FHIR resource and you think that it should have different system URLs.
Yeah. You won't have enough information to create.
I don't know which one's
to
which.
assign the correct value for system. Yep.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
That's how it's important. Yeah.
Yes. And so to me, it's about making sure that given these two tables, I can uniquely identify each identifier so that I can set the correct system URL in FHIR.
So it looks like that this is a sufficiently important issue that needs to be resolved with a bit of broader consultation and some form of agreement. So next step is Daniel, suggested that should we then include this as an agenda item at the March work group meeting face to face.
Yeah, and I think it's Connectathon Day. I think it's talking to all the implementers and finding out what's implemented and how they use things, inviting them to a breakout, which doesn't have to be long, and running like a mentee to go like, here are our options. What will be most useful, and going like, here's what we can do with this.
Right.
I think
So
Angus has represented a really clear, useful position that we can take forwards, and we need to now socialize that with the community.
Yeah, I think it'd be interesting, to have a set of rules and that we can reapply and then go through and make sure what's broken and what's missing. And
yep, agreed.
see.
So action arising from this. So who is going to include this in the Connectathon as one of the breakout for discussion?
Well, let's confirm. Richard, are you still coming? Are you still happy to run a breakout?
I'm still coming. I'm still happy to run a breakout on this.
Okay, then we'll.
But basically, it seems to be, we suspect our use of identifier type is broken. What do we want to do to fix it? And how can we transition from one to the
Not
other?
all of them are broken.
No, I actually think the damage is not too bad, but it's there's things that are definitely an issue. Yeah.
The damage isn't bad because very few people are using PAIOs. So if you scroll to the very bottom of that table, you can see the representation of it, like at the very bottom of the whole page. Down the bottom there, see on the right, it shows you HPAO, OSHIC, NOI. So if that happens to be a PAIO, I can't tell the difference.
Hang on. Should I make it bigger? No.
No, the very last row.
The last row.
Oh, sorry. Both rows do it. Same thing in both rows.
Yeah.
Oh, well, hang on. One is What's NPIO?
Oh, no, that's different. NPIO is its own very specific.
Oh, it's the combination of HPII. Yeah. So that bottom one, right? If you're going to make PAIs as exactly the same, then that's my problem. How do I tell the difference?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Good.
All right. So now we know that Richard is going to the Connectathon. Richard is happy to run a breakout session. So then the next action is to put it on the Connectathon as one of the tracks or one of the breakout sessions.
I assume assign that action to Brett.
Okay, we'll assign that action to Brett.
Yes.
90 to work through. Do we have a Connectathon agenda? A Connectathon breakout agenda?
There's one. Yeah, I don't think it's populated, but we can.
Okay, so we know for sure there's going to be breakout rooms.
Yeah, there's breakout rooms available.
Okay, and so we can choose when we want to do that. As far as I know, there's going to be IG authoring. There'll be this one where there's also suggested to be a patient summary one. And I don't know if, Angus, do you know if FHIR Requesting is interested in doing any breakouts?
I'm not so sure about the Connect. We got the day before we're doing R2 planning, but breakouts for the Connectathon, I'm sure Andy's got some in his head, but not clear.
Right.
See.
Well, since we might be first contributors, we can just pick the dates we want, the times, and then whoever comes next can fill out the other bits.
And can I think we're on the point. It'd be nice if you can sort out how to represent the HPAO and MSH4 because that's a mess in V2. It's the same sort of problem, right?
Ooh.
The use of these codes.
Hang on, HPIO
see this example is an XON data type. But the sending facility in MSH4 is not an XON.
Yeah, go on.
Yeah, like at the top of the message, Brett, MSH.
Yeah.
And then you've got, and in pathology we go NATA number, and then and NATA works, right? Because we've defined, but for HPAO, there's no clear definition of how do you put a HPAO and MSH4, and yet for radiology, they haven't got a NATA number, right? And the lung cancer registry incorrectly tells them to use a format of HPAO in a sort of dumb way, right? Because there's no clear advice. So it's kind of like important, right? Because I know who sent me this message if I can't use a NATA number.
Yeah, it sounds like you need a V2 working group.
It does sound like we need a V2 working group.
So
Anyway,
Oh,
probably-
so we
probably
should
all
invite
volunteers.
members of the V2 working group to the same meeting.
See who turns up, and then they're the group. Nice.
They've got a secret covert group that's all private and locked.
Well, declare yourself the V2 working group, make your decisions, and then everybody who turned up was involved in the decision, and that sticks.
okay, so is there any, or are there any preparatory works that needs to be done before the work group meeting? Sorry, the Connectathon.
Yeah. I think we need to flesh out a description of the breakout and what we intend to cover, and obviously any prep that people can bring is good.
Yeah, so I think that in that description, so some descriptions about the issues to be addressed, and also some thoughts about the potential options would be great.
Yeah, so Brett and I, as co-chairs, will liaise with you, Richard, to make sure that we can support that happening. Do you have a preferred time? Like, are you getting in that morning? Like, are there any constraints on when that breakout will suit you across the 2 Connectathon days?
So this is on one of the Connectathon days.
They're Wednesday, Thursday, so it's I think
Right,
11 and
okay.
12 of March.
I'm booked to show up late morning on the Tuesday, the working group day, and so I'll be there for the whole chunk.
Okay, then if you don't have any other constraints, we'll just pick a spot,
Yep.
and we'll liaise with you to make sure everything's ready. And I'll ask you things like, do you have access to a Menti account, or should we try to find some way to do? I guess it depends on how we're going to run the breakout as to what kind of like crowd collaboration tools, crowd collaboration tools are best for it.
These are good questions. I haven't thought of them. I have no idea whether I have access to do something in Menti or not. So rather than having an audience for this, shall we talk about this later?
No, I think that sounds good. If you could find out beforehand, if the agency has a Menti account that you're allowed to use for this, that's great. If not, we could figure out one.
I'm not aware that the agency has a Menti account.
Okay.
So I think if you need an Menti account to manage that, I think probably someone else outside the agency will have to do it.
Yeah, we can do that.
That would be
Plus,
great.
there's like trial use free ones too, so it's easy enough to like spin up an account and use something cheaply.
They keep getting better at stopping us using software they don't recognize.
Well, okay.
I mean, look, maybe it'll work.
No,
It's
it's
just
fine.
that in general, they do keep getting better at stopping us from using software they don't recognize.
Yep.
HL7 could invest in one.
A Menti account? Oh, well, that's a different conversation. Okay.
All right. In the interest of time, we are halfway through the meeting time already. So do we need to spend more time on this agenda item, or can we kind of move forward?
We should, we got a plan, so I think we
All
should
right,
go
good.
on. Yeah.
So we have a plan, we have action, item that we have someone assigned to. At this point in time, it's Daniel and Brett. So to do the coordination and liaison. So okay, all right, all good on agenda item number 3. All right, moving forward to agenda item number 4. I'll share my screen again. Or do you want to share screen? Brett?
R7 next steps. Okie dokie. I love that it says to do. Okay. So this is a little bit of an admin, and this is like planning the planning. So AU base R7, obviously we're already discussing content that will go into some next release of AU base. What I think we need to do is kind of a repeat of what we did last year. So Oh, so there really is a secret group, Angus. Just looking at the chat message, exciting. I think, need to identify and contact the potential sources for AU base and invite a discussion on forecasting for some of the AU based content. So I think we can do a quick run through of that in this meeting. There's, I think, a lot of people on the line who can identify some key downstream projects. We need to work out some of our planning on comms and timings to engage with the community and invite some submissions. And we will need to go through our backlog and talk about, I guess, owners for that and some people we want to contact. Some of that's overlapping. So all the existing HL7 AU downstream projects, which is, well, I mean, that's core, that's e-requesting, that's patient summary. I think PD is limbo. Should be contacted. In fact, in the backlog of AU base, there are a number of deferred items from e-requesting because there wasn't sufficient time to work through those in R6. So I think that we need to engage with the e-requesting project and seek advice on if these are priorities to be worked through in this release, and who's going to be available and own that work. I don't know if there's anything in the backlog from core. I don't think there is, and I don't think there is from patient summary either. Patient summary has only brought like one topic, but I think they don't have backlogs yet, but they will.
No, and there's a number of just specific issues and kind of questions around material that we have never looked at in committee. I know Graham has a couple of tickets on sex and gender questions and stuff like that, which are kind of just issues on existing material.
Is there anything else that people think that we should be thinking about for forming the work that we're going to undertake in R7 of AU base? I guess actually, no, I'll correct myself there. I only talked about downstream projects that were HL7 AU. There are the projects the agency is doing. I don't know if Richard or Stephen, you could comment on those. I mean, obviously there's things like HCA that is happening, and that's driving, I guess, these two new identifier profiles. Are there any of the other projects coming through the agency that would potentially have content feeding into AU base in the next like 8 months?
There are likely going to be sort of new requirements, but I don't think that we have a decision as to sort of how kind of well, the priority of those kind of requirements. So at this point in time, I don't think that at least from my perspective, I can kind of shed any shadow as to sort of whether or not those kind of requirements would come into this R7 backlog work or new work.
What projects are they, just out of interest?
Those are sort of related to like, say, for example, aged care reporting requirements, those kind of things that might have a bit of clinical content, but more of the administrative, financial type of content. But that's sort of at this point in time, we are doing some analysis work, but we are nowhere near any decision as to whether or not sort of that will become a work item that needs to be submitted.
So I think
It occurs to me that a useful thing for the working group to do is to make clear the sorts of dates, what sort of close off times, like, if you want to have something in release 7, then we need to have had the conversation start by, say, the 1st of July, and we need to have got the design well socialized by the 1st of October or something or other like that. I think that can be useful for the agency to be able to say to projects, if there's stuff that falls out of this and you want it to happen in next year's release, well, we're going to have to have jumped. We're going to have to have finished these pieces of work by these dates, and I think that's likely to be useful. So that's going the other way, rather than finding out what the agency is wanting to do. It's a case of letting the agency know how soon they have to make up their mind.
I mean, we can decide a content closure point, at which content closure means AFMM1, which means things have to be in, obviously, at least a fortnight before that. But how long? I mean, obviously, even with these identifier profiles and with other identifier profiles, they always take ages. So it depends on what content is coming through. If someone's suggesting adding a single code to an existing value set, that's often really quick. If we're doing entirely new profiles or entirely like whether they're identifiers or new resources, we could provide, I guess we could look historically and go, well, that's usually a 3-month job. To be quite frank, it's usually a 3-month job to go from let's talk about it in the first place to it's AFMM1 and can be balloted.
I don't think hard dates. I don't think we need hard dates, but I think that indicative stuff is going to be useful for people.
Yeah, I think that some indicative timeline will be useful. And the other thing that I'm thinking will be useful is about domain priorities. So if this work group can have some indicative information about whether the clinical domain will be of high priority, or the administrative financial type of domain will be of higher priority. Within the clinical domain, is age share considered as one of the priority? Those kind of things would be useful to help not just the agency, but the stakeholders coming up with some suggestions.
With my co-chair hat on, neither. The priority is supporting the community in base. So it's whatever the community has formed and is able to do in the time and is of interest to the community. If someone wants to come up with billing and we have enough representation and a group of people working on it, then we work on it. If that's the only prerequisite for the work that comes into AU base, because it's so broad and definitional, it's something that's of a priority to the community and we have enough representation in the community to say that we can actually make a decision. That's the only prereqs.
Okay, fair enough.
Yeah, I think because there's the decisions that need to be made, but somebody actually has to bring the work, because we don't have a full-time IG facilitator to write up what's been decided. So people will have to contribute to get that material in.
We're moving to that sort of approach too in AU Core to a degree. We're trialing that. That was we've got quite a number of things coming through from different people now in terms of where are the priorities for AU Core. And so that's going to be based on what does the community want in AU Core and what can we get done in the time frame and what can people actually drive and contribute to.
Yeah, that aligns perfectly with international practices. So that is a reasonable approach. I'm just thinking that from the Australian perspective, if there are any other guidelines that we can think of would be useful, but otherwise, I think
there is actually, a guideline on that, and that is that AU base doesn't do use case specific, so it will not. It'll do base resource profiles that are inclusive / agnostic, whatever you want to call it, to a use case, but it won't actually be a for a very specific use case with like obligations and must support or whatever else. So there's always that caveat that even if it is being driven from an aged care perspective, it's definitional, not actually the spec that you will implement totally in exchange.
Okay, reasonable. All right. Anything else?
So still on this topic, are there any other projects that we should contact? So I think the co-chairs can send out some emails to contact them to say, hey, we're gearing up for AU Base R7. We'd like to invite you to a call. I think that would be good. Like, let's get all the projects maybe to come to a call or submit via email if they can't make it, to like identify things that are of priority to them over the next 8 months, so we can like get a better picture of that.
At the previous CDG and also TGG kind of workshopping days, there were 2 items being mentioned. One is the clinical notes initiative, and the other one is the chronic disease or chronic condition management. So shall we be, given that the workshops are on next week, shall we be kind of making some announcement at that avenue, so invite people who are sort of participating in those discussions to put forward some suggestions?
I don't think so. I think because those ones are community workshops with like 100+ people who are coming together to work on a particular thing. I think that's the value of having projects and a project facilitator who has like done the mentees and gathered up what do people care about, what don't, what will we work on. And it's the representatives from the projects that can come to this call and go from all of their like all-day workshops, like synthesize that. We don't need to redo the ground up work in this call. We want to get the summary and results and outcomes in this call from the different projects.
Okay.
So I think inviting comment from GCMP or that would be another project to send them an email and go, hey, we're doing AU Base R7 work. We're going to talk about invite you to come talk about some of the priorities, if there's anything that you're going to put in AU Base or forecast for that. I think that's another project we should add to the list. Yeah.
Okay, that'll be fine. And we can actually sort of pick up more of those conversations at the work group co-chairs meetings as well.
Yeah, I think it's important with people. People obviously have projects with a destination, and if they can bring the parts of their project they can push through AU Base ahead of actually delivering their project, that's much better for them, because like we'll come back and ask questions as to why these things haven't been brought into the national discussion. So that's always a good idea if we can catch them early, and they can just break down their own project and their own needs and decide which things to bring through, and that they're in a better place when they go to publish. Yeah.
All right. Okay. So do we have anything else that we need to discuss on agenda item number 4?
Just wanted to say timings. So we can go out and engage them, and then there's a backlog review. Our next meeting is face-to-face, Sydney, which is still under discussion if it's hybrid, I think.
Yeah, that's one thing that I want to mention for item number 5 and item number 6.
So I think that's the wrong forum, and it's too early maybe to have invited all the projects to come speak. I think we want to schedule it for the online call directly after the Connectathon. That's my thought. Does that timing work for other people? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think it makes sense to have further discussions on a conference call after the March meeting in Sydney.
All right, so some of the co-chairs for the FHIR Work Group will get together and talk about comms and emails to send out to talk about contacting the projects and inviting them to sort of come and do some speculation on the future.
Sounds good.
The backlog thing though, how are we going to proceed on backlog review for AU Base?
Do we have a list of the backlogs with some suggested priority?
There is a preliminary list which has broken it down into separate things. So like there's some basic categories. There's like individual issues, which are like, I've got questions on content as it is now, or an extension to something we already have. There's a whole set of new resource profile requests. There's 2 or 3 of those. And
so do you have those pieces of information on a conference page that you can share?
I think they're all
also...
deferred JIRAs, aren't they?
There's a bunch of deferred JIRAs. There's a whole bunch of open JIRAs too that are kind of sitting there. So let me...
So shall we include those in the meeting minutes?
Do we want to do a preliminary, as long as we're not making official decisions, backlog review at the face-to-face in Sydney?
Yep.
I think that would be good because I do have a page that sorry, so there's I have a page where there's like most of the issues listed, but I think there's a few missing from there. So maybe we can go through it at the event, at the work group, face-to-face. So I think then, and some of those are obviously project-related things as well. So again, those are things that could come back through that discussion. But I think too, there's a set of things which I kind of think would be just business that we should get around to doing, and we need to kind of get. There's individual issues that kind of need addressing and need a response, and they're kind of ones that probably need some committee time to form a response. So I think we need to just kind of go through the list and see how many there are. And I'll do like, I remember way back we did this before, like also there's things that like you kind of go, oh, this is obsolete or not going anywhere kind of issues as well. And we can kind of assess those as well. So that might be a good thing to do at the event. I can get all prepared as well.
I see a couple of approaches to the backlog. One is we book a block of time at each meeting, and have a list of items we go through, and then we go through them cold. And this seems to be a high effort one. The other one is, but it means that you don't have to nominate a bunny to go and pre-digest the stuff. The other one is you choose somebody to go away and have a look at a few, and then come and present them to the working group. And then stuff can be, we make a decision, or we can say, tell us more. There are a couple of approaches. I'm not sure if either of them is going to work better than the other.
I think like the co-chairs look at all the incoming issues and work through a triage of that. So, I mean, we could, I mean, it might be a good idea to do that, is to bring few, like, 1 or 2 of those through for every meeting, just to keep things moving along. Because there is a bunch of stuff that kind of has been sitting there for, probably since after the last ballot, and hasn't moved forward really. So I don't know, co-chairs, we can.
I mean, it could be a.
Why don't we just trial an approach, one of them, and see if it works?
Yeah, a recurring item of half an hour spent on issues, and it's time boxed, and you get to the end of the half hour. If you haven't finished issue 2, then it gets deferred.
Yeah, but if someone owns that issue and really cares, they can ask, right, and say, I want to come and talk about this issue, and that's probably the ones that are going to get seen first, right? Because there's somebody moving to get them resolved. So I think we will prioritize that because people are bringing the issue and want to talk to it.
How do people express the issue? They edit the forthcoming agenda and put it on with their name next to it?
Contact the co-chairs. We'll put it on.
Yep.
I think that's part of when we prep for a new release, we re-advertise the ways by which you can progress something you care about. One of which will obviously be coming to the meeting. Another, now that we've got the FHIR Work Group or the AU base, I think we should make use of the Zulip thing, so someone can say, hey, I really want to bring this topic, this JIRA, into the next release.
Yeah.
That's probably visible for people then.
Yep.
And obviously you can email a co-chair or whatever, but I think use of Zulip looks like it works pretty well for some other projects.
I think that's a good way.
And then obviously in a meeting, someone can put their hand up every time Stephen or another chair, but it's usually Stephen, says, this is the agenda. Is there anything that people want to add to that? Someone can say, absolutely, I have this new thing that I want to add.
Yep, that's a part of the administrative process at the beginning of the meeting, or even sort of towards the middle of the meeting if someone wants to add something. Okay, so anything else on action number, on agenda item number 4 before we move on to number 5? All right, in the interest of time, it looks like that we have completed the discussion on number 4. Let's go to number 5, and then we move on to number 6. With number 5, I think we at the previous work group meeting, we've decided that Danielle will be chairing the work group meeting breakout sessions or the work group meeting sessions in Sydney, and Shelley has been nominated to be a scriber. We are still working through the hybrid approach as to whether or not that can be supported and how it should be supported. Anything else from you, Brett, and also Danielle, to add to this discussion?
Only will be Q1 on that day, for sure.
There's also a possibility, because I know there's discussions from HL7 Australia on providing a short introduction on the operationalization of the GOM and some of the new structures, and that is probably, I think, also Q1. So we might, although we're slotted in for Q1, a portion of that time might be a joint session with that before we split up and e-requesting goes to their room and we go to our room to continue on.
All right, so anything else on this item? All right, if nothing else, then let's move to agenda item number 6 about the Connectathon. And we also are given that we are running some tracks, whether or not some of those tracks, like the identifier tracks, might want to support hybrid format instead of just all the face-to-face. So I'll leave it to you, Brett, and also Danielle, to take on this one, number 6.
Yeah, we're running tracks as per usual. So that's in the sense that we're doing our AU Core tracks for AU Core and patient summary. E-requesting track will run, and the Smart App launch track will run. So they're the same ones that have run in the previous few events. Yeah, so I think the form of that is pretty much similar to previous events as well. The AU Core will have a group of a 101 activity for people that are kind of new to standards and new to HL7 Australia standards. So that will run, and I think the other groups are kind of setting up their own business in terms of things to do. That's about it, because I mean, there are kickoffs. So kickoffs are planned for next week on Monday. I don't think any comms has come out
No, it's not next week.
a week after.
It's the 2nd of March.
Oh, that's good because it's not next week. 2nd of March. So yeah, some comms will come out from track leads on that. And that'll go through exactly what's going to happen. But it'll be pretty much the same approach as the last few sessions, really. That's probably the only thing worth noting. Yeah, I can't think of anything extra.
All right. If nothing else, then
Does anyone have any questions that they want to ask? If we don't know, we can reach out to HL7 Australia, people who are organising it, like Nadi and so forth, and come back with some answers.
Yeah, I think it's worth even through the Connectathon days as well. We do have a couple of extra rooms, I think, as well for people that want to step out for another meeting or something like that. So if you have a little group that wants to talk about something, there are some rooms available. But I don't think we've formalised anything around that.
So, Brett, can we include a link to the Connectathon conference page
I'll do
to
that.
the meeting minutes?
Yeah, I'll post one to the main Connectathon page. The track page is children underneath that as usual.
Thank
Just
you.
doing that now. All right.
All right. So anyone has any further discussions or questions on the Connectathon event?
So just some clarity, Brett, who do we suggest a time for those breakouts? Or is HL7 Australia going to dictate those times for the kickoff meetings? I mean,
For the kickoff meetings, they're scheduled for our track kickoff. Like not the in-person, the online ones are already scheduled. They're in the FHIR calendar.
Yeah, if track leads have an issue, we can adjust.
For the in-person,
it would be nice to have been notified of that.
Yeah.
It's on the FHIR calendar.
Yep.
All right. Anything else?
For the breakout, I think we might do the same kind of approach as last time, create a breakout page and people can put their timings in on the preference that it's sequential rather than overlapping so that people get the opportunity to go to all the breakouts if that's possible.
Yeah, so breakouts, there's a limited number of slots, so we'll have to get our items in.
All right, sounds good. All right, so in that case, then we can move on from number 6 to number 7. Any thoughts on that number 7, which is next meeting plans, which will be what I'm thinking we will be looking at. The next meeting plan will be beyond the face-to-face at Sydney.
Yeah, I think that's it. Yeah, because we brought this meeting forward that was overlapping next week, and
so as far as I understand it, it'll be continuing probably the HSP-O discussion. We're going to do backlog. We're going to do backlog discussion and go through. We'll socialize the timings, I think, for base, which we'll continue to do, and we need to put on a site somewhere. And there was one other item. What is it?
What is the date of the next meeting? My
It's
calendar
the 10th of
has
March.
The 10th of March, Tuesday.
Yes, because it's in person. The
Oh,
next
right.
one,
Okay. It's in person.
yeah,
And then the one after that will be on the, I guess, the 25th.
I don't know. Let me look at so the FHIR Work Group calendar, like the conference calendar is up to date. The Outlook invites aren't, because we're still waiting on notification if this is hybrid. If it's hybrid, then we can send out like the ICS file with like the link, like how do you join if you can't come in person. So that's what the delay has been.
Thank you.
So
Yeah, it's the 25th. You're right, Richard. The
Yeah.
next one's 25th.
So yeah, I have it on the calendar on the screen share. So the next meeting will be the physical meeting or in-person meeting in Sydney, and then we have a week of gap, and then the 25th of March would be our next conference call. Okay, anything else to discuss? If nothing else, then we will close this meeting, and thank you everyone for participation and your contribution. So I'll give you 14 minutes back for your day.
Fantastic.
Good. Thanks all.
All right,
We'll see you next
thank
week.
you.
Aaron.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Bye.